Get that woman out of my house.
Vanessa, lower your voice.
Not in front of donors. Not in front of the cameras.
She is not a stranger. Sir, should I call the medical transport?
Don't let them take the bluebird.
I looked down and saw it in my mother's palm. A cracked enamel pin shaped like a blue bird with 3 letters scratched beneath the wing. M.W.H. My father's initials. The mayor, standing near the staircase, dropped his champagne glass. "Where did she get that?" he asked. And for the first time that night, my wife stopped ordering people around. She stepped back. To understand why that little blue bird terrified the most powerful people in my home, I have to go back to the morning I found my mother behind the old bus station. My name is Marcus Whitmore. I am 50 years old, and until that Tuesday morning in October, I believed my mother had died before I was old enough to remember her voice. I run Whitmore Urban Renewal Group, a real estate company I built out of a single renovated duplex on the south side of Atlanta into a firm that now shapes entire blocks of this city. That morning, I was standing on a stretch of cracked asphalt behind the old Greyhound station downtown, the property my company was days from closing on, the one we planned to turn into a luxury residential tower with a rooftop that would look out over the whole skyline. It had been raining since 5, not the loud kind of rain, the kind that just settles into a city and stays. The station itself had been closed for years, boarded up after the city rerouted its transit lines, but people still gathered in the covered breezeway behind it, the way water still finds the same low ground even after the river has been redirected. My site manager had warned me twice already that the area needed to be cleared before the demolition permits went through. I had told him to give it time. I did not fully understand, standing there in the rain, why I had told him that. A small crowd had gathered near a row of shopping carts and flattened cardboard, the way people gather around something they already suspect is bad news. I walked over out of habit more than curiosity. 20 years in this business teaches you to notice what other people look away from. An old woman was lying against the station wall, wrapped in a soaked blanket, her lips the color of ash. Somebody had already called for help, but help in that part of the city takes its time. I crouched down beside her the way I would crouch beside any stranger in trouble. That was all she was to me in that moment, a stranger. Then she opened her eyes, looked directly at my face, and said the words that changed everything. "Little Blue." I want you to understand something about that name. Nobody had called me that in over 40 years. Not a teacher, not a friend, not one single person alive as far as I knew. My father used to call me that when I was small enough to sit on his shoulders on Auburn Avenue on Sunday mornings, back before he passed, back before I understood what the name even meant. He said it came from a song. He never finished explaining it. He died when I was 9 years old, and the story I was raised on was simple and final. My mother had died not long after him in a fire at a shelter downtown, and I had been raised by an aunt who did her best and a family attorney named Leonard Pike who handled what was left of my father's estate. That story had been the floor I stood on my entire adult life. And here was a dying woman behind a bus station calling me by a name that story said nobody alive should know. I did not fall to my knees. I did not weep in the rain like a man in a movie. I have spent my whole career learning to keep my face still while my mind works. So I kept my face still, and I asked her one question. "What did you call me?" She lifted her hand, slow, shaking, and opened her fingers. In her palm sat a small enamel pin, chipped at the edges, shaped like a bird. Blue paint worn almost to metal in places. "Your daddy gave me this," she said. "Told me if our boy ever got lost, show him the blue bird. He'd know home was real." I did not know yet if I believed her. I only knew I was not leaving her on that sidewalk. I called my personal physician before I called anyone else, and I put the frail woman in the back seat of my car with the heat turned all the way up, my suit jacket around her shoulders. She was so light. That is the detail that stayed with me the whole ride. A grown woman should not weigh what she weighed. She drifted in and out, mumbling things I only half caught. A hymn, a street name. My father's full name said clearly, the way you say a name you have said 10,000 times in your own head and never out loud to another living person. My phone rang 4 times before we reached the Buckhead gate. Vanessa, asking why I was not home yet, reminding me the donor dinner started at 7 o'clock sharp, reminding me the mayor was already in the drawing room. I did not tell her what I was bringing home. I did not fully know myself what I was bringing home. I only knew that if I was wrong about this woman, I would rather be wrong with her, warm and fed, than right and have left her in the rain. I kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, half expecting her to disappear the way certain dreams do the moment you try to look at them directly. She did not disappear. She kept breathing, slow and shallow, fogging a small patch of the window with each breath. And I remember thinking that a woman who had been dead to me for 40 years should not be capable of fogging glass. Once, at a red light, she gripped my sleeve with more strength than I thought she had left in her. "Don't let the pink lady sign me away," she said. I did not understand the words then. I only remember thinking, quietly, that whoever the pink lady was, this woman was afraid of her, the way you are afraid of somebody who has already hurt you once. I had no idea yet how soon I would understand exactly who she meant. That brings us back to where I started this story. The foyer, the dinner, my wife's voice cutting through a room full of people who mattered to our business and our name. Vanessa stood there in pastel pink, her hair pulled back in the same neat bun she always wore for donor nights. The picture of a woman who had never once been caught without an answer. And for the first time since I had known her, she did not have one. The mayor was still staring at the pin in my mother's hand. "Where did she get that?" he asked again, quieter this time, as if he did not want the rest of the room to hear him ask it twice. I did not answer him. I was watching my wife. Vanessa's eyes moved from the pin to my mother's face, to mine, running some calculation I could not yet read. Then she turned to the guests, and her voice found its polish again, smooth as the marble under our feet. "Everyone, please, help yourselves to the terrace. Marcus and I will handle this." The room emptied slowly, the way a room empties when everyone wants to leave and nobody wants to look like they are running. Denise, our housekeeper of 11 years, caught my eye from the hallway before she disappeared toward the kitchen. She did not say anything. She did not need to. I had known Denise long enough to read the particular stillness on her face. the stillness of someone who has just recognized something she is not ready to say out loud. I carried my mother up to the east guest room myself. Vanessa followed us as far as the doorway and stopped there, arms folded, watching me lay a woman she believed was a stranger down on 800 thread sheets. "We need to talk," she said. "Tonight." "We will," I said, "after she's warm." Vanessa found me in my study a little after 11 p.m. Once the last of the donors had gone home and the house had gone quiet enough to hear the rain against the windows. She did not raise her voice. She almost never did. That was one of the things about my wife that made her so effective in every room she ever walked into, and so hard to argue with in the ones that mattered most. "Marcus, I need you to hear me as your wife, not your opponent," she said.
A woman appears out of nowhere, knows one old nickname, and suddenly she's family? People do this. They study grief. They learn just enough to sound convincing, and then they attach themselves to a man who has more heart than sense. She had the pin, Vanessa. Pins can be bought. Pins can be stolen. Pins can be made to look old. She sat across from me, folding her hands the way she did in board meetings. I am not saying send her into the street. I am saying we protect this family until we know the truth. A doctor, a proper evaluation, and, Marcus, a DNA test before this goes any further than it already has. You built this company reading people, Marcus, she went on. Reading contracts, reading risk. I am only asking you to read this the same way you would read anything else that landed on your desk unannounced, with a stranger's signature and no history behind it. I want to be honest about something here because it matters for everything that came after. Part of me agreed with her. Part of me had spent 40 years believing my mother was dead, and it is not an easy thing to unlearn a grief you have carried since childhood, even when hope is standing right in front of you. Vanessa was not shouting. She was not cruel in that moment, not in any way I could point to and name. She was careful and reasonable, and that was exactly what made her so hard to argue with. So I agreed to the test. I told myself that was caution, not doubt. I did not yet understand that caution and doubt can wear the same face. The test would take days to come back. In the meantime, I sat with her. I did not ask her to prove anything. She offered it anyway, quietly, the way you offer something you have carried so long, it no longer feels like proof. It just feels like memory. She told me I had a birthmark on my left shoulder blade, shaped, she said, like a comma. She was right. She told me my father used to hum a song called Bluebird Over Auburn Avenue while he shaved in the mornings, a song I had not thought about in 30 years and could not have named for you if you had asked me the week before. She told me that when I was 4 years old and running a fever, I would only take my medicine mixed into peach tea, never anything else, and that my father used to hide a little cash under a loose floorboard in our old house in case anything ever happened to him. None of that was in any file. None of that was in any newspaper story about my family, because there had never been a newspaper story about my family before I made my first $1 million. I sat in that guest room a long time after she fell asleep, turning all of it over. Vanessa's words followed me anyway. A good con artist studies grief before she knocks on a rich man's door.
I hated that I could not fully silence that voice in my head. I hated it more because some part of me understood exactly why it was there. I'd spent my whole life being the man other people came to for help, not the man who needed to be rescued. It is a strange, humbling thing to sit across from your own possible mother and still not trust your own certainty. My son Caleb is 12 years old, quiet in the way children are quiet when they are paying closer attention than the adults around them realize. He found her on the third morning, sitting up in bed, humming something low under her breath. He did not ask her for proof. He simply sat down at the edge of her bed and asked her what the song was. "Bluebird over Auburn Avenue," she told him. "Your granddaddy wrote it for me before you were even a thought in this world." Caleb came to me that evening while I was reviewing site plans at my desk, his phone held out in front of him like something fragile. "I recorded her singing it, Dad," he said. "I know you probably want the test to be sure, but I don't think grown-ups always need proof to know something is true. I just know." I looked at my son for a long moment. 12 years old, and he had already worked out something it was taking his father, a man who had built an empire reading people and numbers, days to even consider. "Where did you learn that?" I asked him. "From watching you," he said, "before you got scared of being wrong." I did not have an answer for that. I still do not, some nights. What stayed with me longest was not even the recording. It was the way Caleb had sat with her for nearly an hour before he ever mentioned it to me, asking her about her favorite hymns, about what Atlanta looked like when she was young, about nothing that required proof at all. He had simply treated her like a grandmother, instead of like a claim that needed verifying. I wondered, driving to the office the next morning, when exactly I had stopped being able to do the same. I need to tell you the story I grew up believing, because you cannot understand what happened next without understanding what I lost the first time. My father, Malcolm Wendell Hayes Whitmore, everyone just called him Hayes, died when I was 9. A heart condition nobody caught in time. I remember the funeral more than I remember him, if I'm honest. Black umbrellas, a choir singing something slow, my aunt's hand gripping mine so tight it left a mark. I was told my mother had gone into a decline after that she had been staying at a women's shelter downtown while she got back on her feet, and that a fire swept through part of that shelter less than a year later. I was told there was very little left to bury. I was told by our family attorney, a man named Leonard Pike, that it was kinder not to make a boy of 10 sit through a second funeral in 1 year. My aunt raised me after that, a good woman who worked double shifts at a hospital laundry and never once complained about the boy who came with almost nothing. She kept a framed photograph of my mother on the mantel, and some nights I would stand in front of it and try to remember the sound of her voice. I never could. By the time I was in high school, the photograph had started to feel less like a memory and more like a story someone had told me about a stranger, and I had stopped trying to remember at all, because it hurt less that way. I believed that story for 40 years. I built an entire life on top of it. I told myself that if I worked hard enough, if I built tall enough buildings and signed big enough deals, I could make up for 2 parents who were taken from me before I was old enough to know either of them properly. I told myself grief was the price of ambition, and I paid it without complaint, because complaining felt like disrespecting people I could not bring back. What I did not know
standing in my study 40 years later with a DNA test pending upstairs, was that I had spent my whole life mourning a woman who had spent that same 40 years trying to find her way back to me. Vanessa did not cancel the following week's foundation dinner. She rescheduled it, moved it up, and made it larger. "We control the narrative before the narrative controls us," she told me, and I let her, because some part of me still believed control was the same thing as protection. That night, in front of 40 guests, my wife introduced my mother this way. "This is a woman my husband is generously helping while we verify her story," she said, smiling warm and easy, the smile that had closed 100 donor checks. "We're being careful, of course, for everyone's sake." I watched something small happen in my mother's face. Not anger, something quieter and sadder. The look of a woman who has been called a liability by polite people before and knows exactly how that particular silence in a room sounds. I watched the room recalibrate around her the way rooms do when they are given permission to be unkind without feeling unkind about it. A woman near the dessert table lowered her voice to whisper something to her husband, and though I could not hear the words, I could read the shape of them on her face. Pity dressed up as concern. Somebody laughed softly at a joke I never heard, and I could not shake the feeling that the joke had been about the woman sitting quietly at the far end of my own table. A donor near the bar asked, loud enough to carry, "So she may not actually be his mother?" "We're protecting Marcus from emotional exploitation," Vanessa answered smoothly, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. My mother's napkin slipped from her lap to the floor. One of the guests near her, a real estate partner in an expensive gray suit, actually stepped back from the table rather than reach down near her chair, as if poverty were something you could catch off a napkin. Caleb was the one who bent down and picked it up, not me. I noticed that. I have not stopped noticing it since. 3 days after that dinner, Vanessa's sapphire necklace disappeared from her vanity. Security searched the house the next morning at Vanessa's request, and they found it folded into the pocket of an old coat hanging in my mother's closet. I remember standing in that doorway, looking at the necklace in the guard's gloved hand, and feeling something in my chest go very still and very cold. "I don't know how that got there," my mother said. Her voice did not shake the way you would expect from someone caught in a lie. It shook the way a voice shakes when someone has told the truth their whole life and has just realized for the first time in a long time that the truth might not be enough. Vanessa did not gloat. She never gloated. That was never her style. "Marcus," she said gently, laying a hand on my arm, "this is exactly why I begged you to be careful. I'm not angry at her. I think she's a woman who has had a very hard life, and hard lives make people do things they wouldn't otherwise do. But I have to think about this family." I looked at my mother across that room, an old woman standing very small and very still, while a house full of people who did not know her decided, quietly, what kind of woman she was. I did not yet know that Denise, standing at the end of that hallway with a laundry basket in her arms, had seen that same necklace sitting on Vanessa's own vanity the morning before it disappeared. I did not know it because Denise had not yet found the courage to say it. That night, lying awake beside my wife, I found myself doing something I had never once done in our marriage. I was reading her the way I would read an unfamiliar contract, looking for the clause that did not quite match the rest of the page. I did not like what that habit said about where we had ended up. I did not stop doing it either. The necklace changed the temperature of the whole house. Leonard Pike, our family attorney for over 20 years, arrived 2 days later with a folder of paperwork. Temporary guardianship, a recommendation for psychiatric evaluation, a transfer to a private care facility in Marietta, the kind of place with marble lobbies and locked wings that everyone agrees to call care instead of what it actually is. "Marcus," Leonard told me, sitting across my own desk like it belonged to him, "sentiment has already cost wealthy men everything they built. I have seen it more times than I can count. Protect the company. Protect the boy. Protect yourself. This woman will be looked after." That is not cruelty. That is prudence. My mother did not fight when they came to collect her things. She only looked at me once before she got into the car. "A cage with clean sheets," she said quietly, "is still a cage." I signed the papers anyway. I want you to sit with that, because it is the part of this story I am least proud of, and the part I think matters most. I had found my mother alive after 40 years of believing her dead, and within 3 weeks, under pressure from people I trusted, I put my own signature on the papers that sent her away again. Caleb would not look at me for 2 days after that. It was Caleb who started asking the questions I should have asked first. He found a pastel-colored envelope in Vanessa's study drawer while looking for a stapler of all things, and inside it were drafts of a press statement, transfer papers for the Marietta facility, and a payment record made out to Leonard Pike that predated the necklace incident by nearly 2 weeks. He brought it to Denise before he brought it to me, because at 12 years old, he had already learned that some truths need a second witness before an adult will believe a child. Denise finally told him what she had been too afraid to tell anyone. She had seen Vanessa slip the sapphire necklace into a coat pocket in the hallway closet 2 full days before it was reported missing. She had said nothing at the time because she needed her job, and because accusing the woman who signed her paycheck felt, to her, like a door that only closed one way. "I should have said something sooner," Denise told me later, her voice unsteady. "I kept telling myself it wasn't my place." But watching that woman get sent away in a car, knowing what I knew and staying quiet, that wasn't caution, Mr. Whitmore. That was cowardice, and I'm done being that. I asked our security chief to pull the hallway camera footage from the day the necklace disappeared. It had been deleted. Not lost. Deleted on a specific date by a login that traced back to Vanessa's private office terminal. Denise remembered something the technician had forgotten. Our system kept an older backup server in the security room, one Vanessa did not know still existed because it predated her taking over the Foundation's operations 5 years earlier. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my study with a glass of water going warm in my hand, thinking about my mother in a facility in Marietta, believing, for all she knew, that her own son had chosen his wife's comfort over her freedom. I thought about the bluebird pin, sitting now in an evidence bag in my desk drawer, and I understood for the first time that it might be pointing toward more than just my father's memory. I drove to Marietta the next morning, alone, in a plain navy sweater instead of a suit. My mother did not ask me why I had come. She only asked me one question. "Do you still know how to listen?" I told her I was trying to learn. She asked me to bring her the pin.
When I did, she turned it over in her fingers, pressed gently at the underside of one wing, and a thin sliver of the enamel backing came loose, revealing a tiny, folded scrap of paper tucked inside. On it, in handwriting I recognized from an old church program my father used to keep, were 4 words: New Hope, Choir Room, 3rd floor. Your father hid things in places nobody thought to look, my mother said. He learned that from losing things nobody thought to protect. I held that scrap of paper the whole drive back to Atlanta, turning it over the same way she had turned over that pen for 40 years, waiting for someone to finally ask her to show it to them. I took Caleb and Denise with me to New Hope Baptist Church the next afternoon, the same church where my father had once directed the choir, the church I had donated to quietly for years without ever asking what was still stored beneath its floors. An elder led us into the choir room, and beneath a loose section of flooring near the back wall, we found a small metal box, rusted at the corners, but sealed tight. Inside were photographs I had never seen. My mother, young, holding me as an infant. A letter in my father's handwriting, addressed to her, that spoke of a fire at the shelter that had injured her badly enough to keep her in the hospital for months, but had not killed her. A hospital discharge note dated a full year after the death certificate I'd grown up believing, and beneath all of it, a payment ledger in Leonard Pike's own handwriting, recording transfers made to a facility in another county under a name that was not my mother's, the same year my father's estate was settled. I sat on the floor of that choir room a long time, my son beside me, understanding for the first time that the story I had built my whole life on top of had been a lie somebody else had chosen for me. I confronted Leonard the next morning in his own office, the metal box open on the desk between us. He did not deny it right away. Men like Leonard rarely do. They negotiate first. "Your mother was not well after the fire, Marcus," he said. "Confused, unable to care for a child or herself. I made a judgment call. I told your father's estate she had passed because the alternative was a lifetime of legal complications and a child bounced between an unstable mother and an aunt who was already stretched thin. I believed I was protecting you." "You told me she was dead," I said, "for 40 years. "I told you what let you build the life you have," he said. "Look around you, Marcus. Tell me I was wrong." I looked at him a long moment, thinking about my mother, sitting alone in a facility in Marietta right then, having lost 40 years she could never get back, because one man decided, without asking her or me, what our lives were supposed to look like. "You were wrong the day you decided that was your call to make," I told him. "Not hers, not mine." Later that week, sitting beside my mother's bed in Marietta, I finally asked her to tell me what those missing years had actually looked like. She did not soften it for me, and I did not ask her to. She told me the fire had left her badly burned on one arm and confused for weeks afterward, moved from one facility to another, while paperwork that should have connected her to me simply never did. She told me that when she was well enough to ask about her son, she was told, gently and firmly, that I had already been placed with family, and that reopening old wounds would not serve either of us. She spent years afterward writing letters to addresses that no longer existed, standing outside offices that would not let her in without documents that had conveniently gone missing, until she stopped being treated like a grieving mother and started being treated like a nuisance. Eventually, she told me, she stopped being treated like anything at all. She became simply another older woman the city had lost track of, one more name nobody thought to look up twice. I sat with that a long time. 40 years of a woman trying every door she could find, while I stood on the other side of every single one of them, never knowing she was knocking. I called everyone back to the house 2 nights later. Vanessa, Leonard, Mayor Ellis Grant, who I had learned by then knew more about the old bus station property than he had ever said out loud, Denise, Caleb, my mother, joining by video call from Marietta, her face small on the screen, but her voice steadier than I had heard it since the morning I found her. Vanessa stood at the head of the room, composed as always. "You are humiliating this family over a woman with memory problems," she said. I placed the bluebird pin on the table. I placed the church documents beside it. Then I played the backup security footage, the one Vanessa did not know still existed, showing her own hand slipping a sapphire necklace into an old coat pocket in a quiet hallway, 2 days before she ever reported it stolen. Nobody in that room said anything for a long moment. The mayor set down his glass without drinking from it. Leonard would not meet my eyes. Somewhere behind me, I heard Denise let out a breath she had clearly been holding since she walked through the door, the sound of someone finally setting down a weight she had carried alone for far too long. "I want to be very clear," I said, my voice even, carrying easily in that quiet room the way it never needed to be raised to be heard. "This is not a family disagreement anymore. This is a woman who was declared dead without her knowledge, erased from her own son's life, and then nearly erased a second time by people sitting in this room tonight." "I protected everything you built," Vanessa finally said, quiet now, no polish left in her voice. "No," I said. "You protected the version of me that never asked questions." Caleb spoke up from the back of the room, his voice small but steady. "I was more hurt watching you lie than I ever was watching her be poor," he said, looking at Vanessa. "There's a difference, and I don't think you ever saw it." The DNA results came back that same week, confirmed and undeniable. Ruth May Hayes Whitmore was my mother. But the proof that mattered most in that room did not come from a laboratory. It came from an elder at New Hope who stood in front of everyone gathered and confirmed that Ruth had sung in that choir for years before the fire, that my father had written "Bluebird over Auburn Avenue" for her, and that Leonard Pike himself had come to the church decades earlier, quietly asking questions about her records. Mayor Grant, cornered by his own silence, finally admitted what he had known and never said. The redevelopment project behind the old bus station sat on land tied to the very shelter that had caught fire all those years ago. Land the city had been eager to redevelop quietly without ever accounting for the people it had once failed to protect. "I should have said something the moment I saw that pin," he told me. "I recognized it because my office handled the original shelter fire report. I am sorry, Marcus. That is not enough, but it is true." One board member set his pen down carefully and did not pick it back up. Another simply stared at the framed photograph of the choir that the elder had brought with her. My mother's young face near the end of the second row. My father standing just behind her. Nobody in that room needed a second explanation of what they were looking at. Some truths did not require volume. They only require enough time to sink into a quiet room. And that room had finally gone quiet enough to let it. Leonard Pike's law license would not survive the investigation that followed. Vanessa's control of the Whitmore Legacy Foundation ended that same week, not with shouting, but with a quiet vote of the board she had once run without question. I drove to Marietta myself to bring her home, in the same Navy sweater, no assistant, no car service. "I brought you into my house once already," I told her. "Now I'm asking you to come home." "And if your world laughs at me again?" she asked. "Then they can laugh from outside our gate," I said, "not from inside it." Denise opened the front door for us herself this time. Caleb had placed the bluebird pin on a small velvet cushion in the foyer, waiting for her. The same spot where a security guard had once asked whether he should call a medical transport for a woman he assumed was a stranger. She walked into that house this time without anyone questioning whether she belonged there. Vanessa left the mansion quietly, without the scene I once imagined a moment like this would require. There was no shouting in the end, just silence, and a car pulling away down a long driveway she used to walk like she owned every inch of it. I did not seek revenge, because revenge was never what my mother needed, and it was never who I wanted my son to watch me become. I handed every piece of evidence over to the appropriate authorities. I froze the foundation's accounts pending a full outside audit. I stood in front of our remaining donors myself and told them plainly that I had let paperwork outweigh my own mother's pain, and that I would spend whatever time I had left making that right. Out of that, we built something new, the Bluebird Homecoming Fund, dedicated to elderly homeless women who have been separated from their families, funding legal aid for people whose records have been altered or erased, and building small emergency housing near the very bus station where I found her, on land that was once meant only for luxury towers. I thought more than once about how easy it would have been to simply write a check and call it justice. A donation is comfortable. A donation lets you feel generous without ever having to sit with the discomfort of what you almost let happen. I did not want comfort. I wanted the fund to carry my mother's actual name, Ruth May Hayes Whitmore, printed plainly on every piece of paperwork it ever produced, so that no one working inside it could forget that the woman it existed for once had a name nobody bothered to check. A year later, my mother still wakes at 5 in the morning out of habit, a habit I have stopped trying to talk her out of.
I converted a sunlit room upstairs into a sewing space for her, filled with fabric and a record player that only plays gospel. Caleb has learned 2 more of my father's old songs by heart. Denise now directs outreach for the Bluebird Fund, the same woman who once stayed silent out of fear, now standing in front of rooms to make sure other people are not silenced the way she was. The luxury tower behind the old bus station was redesigned. Part of it is still market housing, part of it is now a shelter and legal aid center, with the Bluebird pin, repaired and framed, hanging in the entrance where every visitor can see it. Caleb asked me once, sitting on the back porch at dusk, whether I regretted ever signing those transfer papers. I told him the truth. I regret it every day, and I have stopped trying to make the regret smaller than it is. I have learned that carrying it honestly is more useful than pretending it never happened. It keeps me slower to sign things now. It keeps me quicker to ask questions before I decide what is best for someone I claim to love. Not long ago, I watched a new visitor step through those doors, an elderly woman clutching an old photograph,
unsure whether anyone inside would believe her story. My mother walked over to her before I could. "Ask her who she's trying to find," she told me. I did not wait for a document or a test this time before I sat down beside her. The shelter opened on a clear Saturday morning in April, and I had not expected the turnout it got. Mayor Ellis Grant stood at the podium himself, not because I asked him to, but because he asked me first. He had spent the months since that emergency meeting quietly rewriting the redevelopment agreement, folding the shelter and legal aid center into the city's own commitments instead of leaving it as a private gesture from one wealthy family. He stood in front of cameras that morning and said something he had not said in any of our private conversations. "I knew about the shelter fire records years before Mr. Whitmore ever found his mother," he told the crowd. "I let a quiet redevelopment move forward instead of asking who that land still owed something to. I am not proud of that. I am proud to stand here today correcting it." I watched my mother's face while he spoke. She did not look triumphant. She looked, if anything, a little embarrassed by the size of the crowd, the way people who have spent years being overlooked often are when a room finally turns to look at them on purpose. Denise stood near the entrance in a simple gray suit, holding a clipboard, already fielding questions from two other women who had shown up that morning looking for the kind of help the building now existed to offer. She had asked me months earlier whether she could run the outreach side of the fund herself instead of staying on as our housekeeper. I told her that was long overdue. After the ribbon was cut, we moved the gathering 3 blocks over to New Hope Baptist Church, where the choir my father once directed still met every Sunday. My mother had not sung in public in longer than I had been alive to remember her singing at all.
She stood at the front of that sanctuary in a simple blue dress. No microphone, just her voice and the old upright piano someone had kept in tune out of habit more than necessity. She sang "Bluebird over Auburn Avenue," the way I imagine my father must have first heard it. Slow, a little unsteady in places, more feeling than performance. Caleb stood beside her and picked up the second verse when her voice caught, the two of them finishing the song together while the whole room went still in the particular way a room goes still when it understands it is witnessing something it will not get to witness twice. I did not try to hold back what I felt sitting in that pew. I had spent 40 years believing that song no longer belonged to anyone living. Hearing it again, in that room, from the two people I loved most, I finally understood what my father had meant when he told me the bird would know home was real. He had not been talking about a pin at all. He had been talking about a voice that would still be recognizable, no matter how many years passed before it was heard again. I want to tell you honestly what became of my marriage, because this story would not be truthful if I skipped past it. Vanessa and I finalized our divorce quietly, without the public war I once might have wanted. She kept her name off the foundation entirely, and to her credit, she did not fight the settlement the way Leonard once advised other men in her position to fight theirs. I ran into her only once after that, months later, at a fundraiser neither of us had realized the other was attending. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way a person looks when they have stopped performing for a room and simply exist in it instead. "I heard she's doing well," Vanessa said, meaning my mother, not able to say her name. "She is," I said. Vanessa nodded, looked at her hands for a moment, and said the only honest thing I ever heard her say about that whole year.
I told myself I was protecting the family. I think I was only ever protecting my place in it. She did not ask for forgiveness, and I did not offer any I did not feel. But I did not carry anger into that room either, because by then I had learned that anger is its own kind of cage, and I had already watched what a cage does to a person who deserved better than one. Leonard Pike sent a letter through his new counsel sometime later, brief and carefully worded, stopping just short of an apology. I did not answer it. Some debts are not settled with paper, and I had grown tired of pretending paper could settle the things that actually mattered. I think often about what my son will carry forward from all of this, long after I am the age my own father was when he passed.
He will not remember the deal that made me wealthy, or the tower we built downtown, or any of the boardrooms I once thought defined a man's worth. He told me as much himself, sitting on the church steps after the dedication, watching his grandmother laugh with Denise over something neither of them would repeat to me. "I'm going to remember that you went back for her," he said, "even after you got it wrong the first time." I asked him what he meant by that. "Most people just remember not to mess up," he said. "You messed up, and then you fixed it in front of everybody instead of pretending you didn't. I think that's harder, actually." 12 years old, and he had already understood something it took his father 50 to learn. Dignity is not never being wrong. Dignity is what you do the moment you find out you were. This story taught me something I wish I had understood 40 years earlier. A cracked pen, a soaked blanket, and a woman's voice calling a name nobody else remembered were never signs of a con. They were the last pieces of proof a family had left after the world decided her story was not worth protecting. If someone you loved came back into your life broken, older, and harder to recognize, would you still know how to welcome them home? Or would you need a lawyer, a test, and a room full of witnesses before you trusted your own heart? Tell me in the comments, and if you believe no mother should ever have to prove her worth at the door of her own child's house, type Bluebird so I know you're still with me.